Hi everybody, I'm Rebecca with Waffle Flower Crafts. I'm super excited to be here for another episode of One Stamp, Three Ways. In this video, we're going to take a look at the Magnolia Stamp Set, and we're going to use it in 3 different ways. The great thing about the Magnolia Stamp Set is it can be colored in lots of different ways. You can use lots of mediums, everything from markers to pencils to even inks. And so we're going to use 3 different techniques today to color that Magnolia Stamp Set and create 3 different looking cards. So let's get started with this first card and this first technique, which is a no-line coloring with pencils. I'm going to be using this large Magnolia stamp from the Magnolia Stamp Set. I'm going to be using some gray paper and some ink on 3 fade out no-line coloring detail ink, which is also a gray color. So the great thing about using gray colors with pencil coloring, especially gray background paper, is that the pencils really show up beautifully on them. So you can use your white pencil to add some highlights and it shows up really, really pretty on that gray paper. So that's what I'm going to start with. I'm going to start with the outer edges of the petals and the leaves, and I'm going to add some white shading, and I'm going to try and go really, really light with my pencil first so that I have more room to layer on other colors. And just like when you're using Copics, you want to use 2 to 3 shades of one color to get the best depth and dimension from your pencil coloring. I like to test out the pencils on the edge of the paper. That's why you see those lines in the corner there. And I'm going to do the same exact thing with the leaves. I'm going to start with the outer edges with some white highlights, and then I'm going to use a light color of green, and then I'm going to use a darker color of green to add the details, the outlines, all of that good stuff. The nice thing about pencils is that it really creates a lot of texture to your coloring, which is easier to achieve than just using markers. For the second card, I'm going to make it a lot easier, and I'm just going to use some very basic ink blending over my Magnolia stamp set. For this card, I'm going to use some Versa Fine Black Onyx ink. I am going to ink it up on Strathmore Smooth Bristol paper because I want to do some ink blending, and I find that's the smoothest paper to blend Distress Oxide inks or other inks over it. So I did heat set that image, and now I am going to grab some little ink blenders. These are really more detailed ink blenders that are a lot of fun to use so that I can do some similar techniques where I can start with a lighter color of ink and then I can add a darker color in the center and on those detail lines. You'll see that there's lots and lots of detail in this stamp set, and the way that it was drawn really indicates where you want to put more color so that you have a really pretty image with lots of depth and dimension to it. I'm going to do the same thing with the leaves. I'm going to use 2 different colors of green so that I can then have all that balance between the lighter colors and the darker colors. I am going to ink up a little background that I cut with the stitched diamond background, and I'm going to pop up my Magnolia with some foam tape and just add a happy birthday sentiment that's also from the stamp set with that same black VersaFine ink. And I love the way the little stitch lines show up in the label if you stamp it right on that background there. For this third and final card, we're going to use a totally different technique, which is using Distress Oxides to watercolor. So I love stamping with Distress Oxide inks, and I also love ink blending with them. But watercoloring can be really fun too, especially if you're trying to watercolor on craft or a dark color of cardstock, because traditionally watercolors would just kind of muddy the color. You wouldn't be able to see those colors on that type of cardstock. But when you're using Distress Oxides, even if you add water to them, they are going to sit on top of the paper. So I'm going to use a very similar technique. I started with the Magnolia stamp that was stamped with Versamark ink and then heat embossed with white embossing powder. That allows me to have walls that the watered ink won't flow through. So it just makes it a little bit easier, I think, for me, because I'm not a watercolor artist. I like to have those little barriers set up by that embossed powder there. I'm going to use the same basic idea of the coloring where I'm going to keep the lightest parts on the tips of the leaves and petals and then have the darker parts on the inside where everything's kind of layering over and creating shadows on each other. Also, that tends to be where the darkest parts of the flower are. I will add some details on the lines of the leaves and also the lines of the flowers in a darker color just to add more dimension and depth. Okay, so I'm going to create the sentiment for this. I'm going to use the same happy birthday sentiment. I'm going to use craft cardstock as well since that's what the flower's on. I'm going to stamp the sentiment in Versamark embossing ink, and then I'm going to cover that with the white embossing powder that I used for the flower. So everything will kind of coordinate together. Once that's all covered up, I am going to heat set that sentiment so that it really stands out just like the lines of the flower do. So let's continue this conversation down below in the comments. Let me know if there are other ways that you would like to color this Magnolia stamp set, or if you just have other ways and techniques to use the stamp set that would make a totally different looking card. Thank you so much for stopping by today. See you soon!